Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 1st of July. Today we're doing a full frontline update about the situation in Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Donetsk. Let's begin by talking about the Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnieper River, which is centered around the southern part of the Antonovsky Bridge. We talked yesterday about the Iskander strike that destroyed one span of the bridge, but another span of the bridge is still standing. Well, now there is a report by Rybar, and I'm going to also bring up reports that contradict Rybar's claim. So you could see that the bridgehead is still marked as under Ukrainian control. But first, what Rybar said is that by the noon of July 1st, the Russian infantry, aided by Russian counter battery fire, was able to clear the entirety of the Antonovsky bridgehead, which would include all of the area that I'm crossing out in red right now. And so what they claim is that the Russians initially took over the Ukrainian positions that were on these rural dachas in the eastern part of the town of Dachi. And then from there, they were able to make their way and attack the main Ukrainian strongholds around the Antonovsky Bridge from the east, and from there just methodically clear it out, which also would include a lot of the rural houses on the western part of the town of Dachi, which were in sort of a gray zone. Although the Rybar map does show that the western part of Dachi, which I have marked over here with these red lines, is still contested. They do say that this area where I have the circle is under full Russian control, and that a big part of why the Russians were able to do this is because Russian counter battery fire was able to silence a lot of the Ukrainian artillery, which is centered around some of the higher elevation. So the Ukrainian positions are like 60 meters above sea level. They overlook a lot of the Russian positions, which is why the Russians were forced to withdraw from some of these areas. You could see there's a lot of a gray zone in this area, and that really opened the opportunity for the Ukrainians to cross the river in the first place. And also the flooding of the dam in the reservoir also played a big role because it destroyed a lot of the Russian fortifications near the river as the flood spread to the areas adjacent to the river. And then as the water receded, a lot of these areas became open again, but the fortifications were destroyed. And so the Russians couldn't really take back a lot of those areas without the fear of being fired upon by the Ukrainians, who had these firing positions that were overlooking their forward positions near the river. And so the claims that were presented by Rybar are disputed by another Russian source, Avdiivka, and they say that the Russians were able to clear the hotel area around the Antonovsky Bridge and all of the surrounding parts of the bridgehead, but that this was a temporary state of affairs, and that the Ukrainians at the time of Russia's offensive activity towards the bridgehead still controlled positions in some of the western dachas in the town of Dachi. And so in response to Russia's offensive activities, Avdiivka, they claimed that the Ukrainians launched this massive counter battery fire and this massive artillery barrage in general towards the advancing Russians, and that there was a lot of smoke and a lot of shelling that was caused as a result. And so in the ensuing smoke, it gave the perfect smoke screen, for these jets, for these jet skis and these speedboats that the Ukrainians are using to cross over the Dnieper River, which, it's a pretty narrow river. You can get over there very quickly on a speedboat. And so the Ukrainians, they quickly moved over during the process of the shelling and resupplied the Ukrainian positions on the bridgehead, sending in new men and new materials to keep them supplied. And then the Ukrainian counterattack meant that they were able to reestablish their positions around the bridgehead, around the original bridgehead. And so it's hard to tell if there were any changes to the front line at the end of the day. And it seems like the Ukrainians have really reestablished control under the bridge where they were initially pushed out of. So that's why I still have the Ukrainians marked as blue over here, although there are conflicting reports. I'm not going to change it until we have anything more concrete. Now, one last thing about Kherson is that there are reports that the Ukrainians are planning to really conduct more regular sorties across the Dnieper River on multiple different axes, and that they're planning to, use these small groups to establish minor bridgeheads, and that it's a part of a wider Ukrainian plan to cross the river in its entirety, take over the Russian town of Oleshki, which is a major hub for the Russians right now. A lot of their units are stored over there, and then, expand the offensive all the way to the south, presumably towards the town of Skadovsk, which is the largest town that the Russians have under their control in this entire area, and a lot of roads branch out from it. And so that's Kherson for you. Moving on to Zaporizhzhia, we do have new reports of Ukrainian attacks, starting off with another Ukrainian attempted assault in the direction of Pyatikhatki. I would remind you guys that the Ukrainians do not have full control over this town, although they are entering the town every day or so. They do not have a fortified set of positions throughout the night, you could say. They have to withdraw in order to avoid shelling from the Russians because Pyatikhatki is in this valley. You could see sort of how it stretches out over here, this entire valleyed area. It also includes Lobkove, where the Ukrainians do have fortified positions, but to a very small extent. And so today there was an attempted assault to get a very firm control over the town by the Ukrainian 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. Over here, again, one of these like old guard units that has been involved in fighting really since the beginning of the war. They're very battle hardened. And so they tried to attack in this area, but they were pushed back for the reasons that I stated before. It's very difficult to hold on to these positions because of the Russian shelling in this direction. And so it still remains a gray zone. Now, moving on to the east, there are continued Ukrainian assaults towards Robotyne. This is becoming now a regular occurrence that I talk about in every single video, but just know I'm not talking about the same assault. These are new assaults every single day that are occurring in this direction. And mainly these are being conducted by the 65th Mechanized Brigade, which has certain assault detachments that have been fighting around the main road towards the town. Just over here, the town, but they are also attacking in the direction of Balka Uspenivka, which is a nature reserve. And they have actually been able to secure really most of the nature reserve and some of its surrounding heights. But in all honesty, the Russians do still hold most of the high ground in this area because there's a massive ridge that spans Robotyne, Kopani, and then a bit to the west and to the north, Nastyoryanka, very hard to pronounce. And so this entire ridge, the Ukrainians really want to establish control over it in this entire general area because it gives them very good positions to begin firing artillery onto the city of Tokmak, which is on more of a valley. It's located through some rivers and some roads, and usually those are built in lower elevated areas. And then the Ukrainians, they would have the high ground in this area if they were able to secure towns like Robotyne. But for now, the Russians do still hold firm in this area, and really the full extent of the Ukrainian gains could be put into this one singular box over here, just looking like this. It's not enough to even break through into the northern outskirts of the town of Robotyne. But let's move on to the situation in Donetsk. So over here, the Ukrainians, they are really splitting up their forces into two groups over here on the front line. Then, of course, you have a lot of forces on the rear. But in terms of the ones that are actively conducting attacks, you have, for instance, the Ukrainian assault groups such as the 35th and 128th Brigades. So the 35th Brigade is the unit over here. Let me find it for you guys. This is the 35th Marine Brigade. And then the 128th Dnipro Defense Brigade over here, Territorial Defense Force. The two of these units, they are trying to fortify their positions to the north of Staromayorsk, and they're beginning probing attacks onto the town itself, trying to find the best spots to begin the actual assault onto the town, which will allow them to advance further to the south around the Mokryali River and reach the supply hub of Staroblinivka. That is the wide, overarching Ukrainian goal in this region. Then a bit to the west, the Ukrainians, and specifically in this area, you have the 31st and 36th Brigades. They are trying to break through the Russian positions to the north of Pryutyne, as we've discussed in previous videos around this ravine area. And so now they're beginning attacks from Lavadnia towards Pryutyne and also from the north, from Rivnopil and Novodarivka. And they are being aided by new shipments of Ukrainian, from the Ukrainian Higher Command from Velika Novosilka, where the Ukrainians are dispersing ammo to different parts of the front line. So this is meant to sort of give the Ukrainians more equipment that will be needed to conduct their offensive activities in this direction. It's important to note that the Ukrainian strategy in this area is to utilize, one or two units and just use very small assault detachments from each unit, and that each one will conduct their attacks in this area, like an open field, for instance. And then once their attacks begin to lose steam, they get rotated with another unit, and then rinse and repeat. And because the Ukrainians do have a lot of reserve in this area, and they do have an entirely new Army Corps, the 10th Army Corps, which includes many of the new units that we've been talking about, like the 31st Brigade, like the 47th Brigade. There are multiple different units that I have mapped over here that come from this 10th Army Corps. They were formed this year, and they are being moved in once the older units fight and have to be rotated out due to high losses. And then, we talked already about some of those units, like the 128th and the 65th. And so a lot of these Ukrainian units, whenever they're being bombarded, they are seeking refuge in certain forest belts where they can hide their equipment and hide themselves so they can't be spotted. And this is just one of the forest belts that the Ukrainians are setting up positions in at the moment. It's very close to the front lines, and then from there they can begin their actual attacks further to the south. Now, moving on to Donetsk. We are starting off with the Avdiivka sector, where the Ukrainians, they're trying to gain the initiative by attacking through this road that passes through Zjeverny all the way to Vodiane, trying to put pressure on the Russian forces. So they're assaulting in this direction. They're trying to establish positions in the adjacent forest belts and the tree belts. And so they have failed so far to actually pierce into Vodiane, but they are actively on the offensive in this specific sector. And the Russians are countering with artillery, which is coming from the 153rd Motorized Rifle Regiment and from the DPR unit, the Spartan Battalion, which is located over here. And then to the north, around the northern flank of Avdiivka, the Ukrainians are continuing to put pressure, but there's no new gains from the last time that I talked about Avdiivka. But you can see that the Ukrainians have pushed back the Russians a little bit in this area, which is making it hard for the Russians to move forward and disrupt Ukrainian supply lines into Avdiivka. So it makes it much more tenable for Ukraine to keep holding on to the city. Now, moving to the north to Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have been able to cross the river, or not even the river, the canal, sorry. The canal, the water here is still present despite all of the fighting and the fact that the water pumps aren't necessarily working, but it's very narrow and it's pretty easy to cross over. You can set up some sort of small crossing and then step over, and you won't have to take off your shoes or anything. And so it's not really an issue to cross over. So you can see that the Ukrainians have been able to do this, and they've taken up positions in the tree lines adjacent to the river. And the Russians have been forced to retreat a bit further to the east towards some of the former Ukraine fortifications that the Russians took over, and they're having to now retrofit it as their own. And so, for instance, there's this one fortification over here. You can see there's some trenches over there. So the Russians are situated over there as their fort positions, also over here. And so now there's clashes going on with some Ukrainian tanks actually crossing over the canal from the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is firmly the Azov Battalion. And so they're engaging Russian soldiers in these fortified areas. They already took over one Russian fortified area, which is very close to the canal. I've been circled over here, and the video is provided. And so this now opens up a new vector of attack for the Ukrainians in the direction of Klishivka. First of all, they could disrupt the supply lines of the Klishivka, because you could see that the road runs through the southern flank. And so the Ukrainians are advancing in that direction, and they could cross the river to reach even closer to this road, and that could cut off supplies from certain areas. And then they could also attack from the south and from the west. And so this is a big danger for the Russians if they don't reinforce their southern flank. So Klishivka could be in danger as a result. Moving up, let's look at the situation around the Zalizhnyansk area. In this area, the Ukrainians have been able to make some minor gains around the E40 highway. So they made gains a few days ago with the 30th Mechanized Brigade, and now the 30th Brigade has really advanced even more. And you could see that the areas that are taken over is around these blue squares over here. It's on a ridge, so they are taking over some of the dominant heights that are overlooking the Ukrainian and also the Russian positions along the Orikovo-Vasilivka Valley. And so if the Ukrainians can continue to take over these positions, then they will be able to set up very good mortar positions to fire onto Dubovo-Vasilivka, because you see they're not attacking it head on anymore. They're attacking the northern flanks, which includes some areas which are on lower elevation, like this one minor valley, but all the surrounding areas are on a higher elevation, like the ones where I have circled over here, these ovals. So that's why the Ukrainians are assaulting in that direction. And the last thing to talk about is the Russian takeover of the water filtration plant to the east of Bilohorivka. I already had this facility under Russian control on my map, so I didn't change anything. But apparently, there's been an update in this area because it seems like previously the Ukrainians controlled it, and only now the Russians have full control over it because there's a new Russian state media report from the plant, which shows how the Russians have been able to establish firing positions within the plant, which are overlooking some of the Ukrainian positions in the open fields to the east of Bilohorivka. And so there's some videos of Russian troops that are overlooking the Ukrainian forward positions as they're trying to traverse through some of the fields. And so this is a perfect area for the Russians to fire onto them and onto the Ukrainian fortified positions within the town of Bilohorivka itself. And so the Russians having a very good control over this plant could be used as a stepping stone to take over the rest of the town of Bilohorivka, which is really the vanguard of the Ukrainian force in this area because they are defending against potential Russian incursions into Donetsk Oblast from that area, which could culminate in an attack on Siversk, but that is very unlikely due to the Ukrainian resistance. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.